This is Polarized Light Microscopy in Archaeology, and this talk is about the pottery of Safavid Iran. This is part of a study published in 2014 called Persian Pottery in the First Global Age, the 16th and 17th centuries. And in this case, I did the petrography and related it to the typology. So this is the globe. And if you remember from the lecture on Basra, this part of the globe was in fact covered by products of Basra. However, hypothetically, we may one day find this 6th and 17th century pottery from Iran in the Americas, which would actually make it global. Here is the greatest extent of the Safavid realm, and here are the modern state boundaries. You can see that the heart of the Safavid realm is the modern state of Iran. But it was reduced by the Ottoman Turks, the successors of the Khanate of Bukhara, being the Russians, and the successors of the Mughal Empire, being the British. In many ways, what we know of as modern Iran is a creation of the Safavid period. In order to understand the Safavids, it is necessary to understand something of Iran, and this will enable the contextualization of the pottery and enable some understanding of the ceramics themselves, their production, and their petrography. To start with, the geology is very important to the pottery. In that regard, it is well to understand that it is very complicated, having been squished by the collision of the Afro-Arabian continent with the Eurasian continent and the Indian subcontinent, together with whatever smaller land masses got squished in between. This is a map of land use in the Middle East. You can see that the overwhelming majority of the land is either wasteland, the light beige bits, or occupied by nomadic animal herders, the darker beige and also the yellow bits. Hence, a significant proportion of the population, particularly in the past, were mobile, especially in Iran and Turkey. Many of these mobile populations, even in ancient times, were peoples that originally came from Central Asia, so the distinction between the desert and the sown, the mobile and sedentary populations, will often have an ethno-linguistic aspect, especially in Iran. In this map of the distribution of Islamic sects, it can be seen that Iran is predominantly of the Shia of the Twelver or Jafari sect. In fact, over 90% of the population is Twelver Shia. In this chart of the family of the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, is here. He is the first of the 14 infallibles of Twelver Shiism. The next is his daughter Fatima and her husband Ali. Ali was the fourth Caliph, or successor of the Prophet, and the first Imam. An Imam was originally meant to refer to the person that goes in front, that leads the community in prayer, and so it remains for Sunni Muslims. But for some Shia, the Imam is the rightful leader of all society and must be descended from the Prophet. Ali was succeeded as Caliph and Imam by his son Hassan, who was succeeded as Imam by his brother Hussein, then his son Ali, then his son Muhammad, then his son Jafar. Then there's a split in Shia groups, with the short-lived Aftaiya, which just lasts a generation, and the descendants of Ismail, being the Ismailis of the present day, and also the Fatimids, and from them the Druze. But for the Twelvers, the next Imam was Jafar's son Musa. Then came Ali, Muhammad, Ali, and Hassan. Now, all of these gentlemen are said to have died under suspicious circumstances, and so are considered martyrs. After the death of Hassan, the 11th Imam, the leaders of the movement claimed that he had a son called Muhammad, who went into a state of occultation, meaning hidden. He, that 12th Imam, is the Mahdi, or Messiah, who will return at the end of days to sort everything out, according to Twelver Shia's belief. An important aspect of Twelver Shi'ism is pilgrimage to the shrines of the Imams, including this one built over the tomb of Ali at Najaf in Iraq, which was actually built by the Safavids. The Safavids are named after a man called Safiuddin Ishaq of Ardabil, born in about 1252. Several generations before, his lineage records that he was descended from a Kurd from Zanjan in Khorasan, who seems to have settled in Ardabil in the 11th century. Eventually the family will claim descent from the third Imam, Hossein ibn Ali, through his supposed marriage to Sharbanu, the daughter of last Sasanian ruler Yazdegerd III. This would make the Safavid dynasty descendants of the Prophet and also the Persian Sasanian dynasty, the last rulers, effectively, of Iran. This is the location of Najaf in Iraq, where Ali's tomb and shrine is. And you can see it is within the Safavid Empire at its greatest extent. That's what this slightly blue-tinged area is. Here is Zanjan, where Safi's ancestors came from. Here is Ardabil, where Sufi was born. And here is Rasht, the capital of Gilan province. Tabriz will be the capital of the Turkmen Karakoyunlu state, which ruled from 1375 to 1468, followed by the Akkoyunlu Turkmen state from 1469 to 1501. The initial rise of influence of the Safavids begins with the establishment of the Zahidiyya Sufi order by Zahid of Gilan. Safi was Zahid's son-in-law and became a spiritual successor of the order after Zahid's death in 1301. So effective was Safi's leadership that the order became known as the Safaviya. Safi transformed it from a local Sufi order to a religious movement which spread across Iran, Syria, Asia Minor, and South Asia. Safi's son and successor, Sadr ad-Din Musa, who led the order from 1335 to 1391, was a contemporary of Timur. The Mongol leader was so favourable to the order that he provided an endowment for the shrine of Safi ad-Din and gifted to Musa a following of thousands of captured Turkmen warriors, which he settled in Gilan. This is why the climate is so important, because of the large mobile population in a period when mobile populations ruled the battlefields. The Safavid connection to this first army of Turkmen warriors, often known as Kizilbash because of their red plume in their turbans, was key to the future development of the Safavids. They became players in the battlefield, and the power grew over the next century. Ismail I, who would become the first Safavid Shah, had an Akkoyunlu princess as a mother, but the Akkoyunlu killed his father in battle, and his old brother was executed by the Akkoyunlu prince, and so Ismail went into hiding. Then, when he was 14, he came out of hiding, and his followers defeated the Akkoyunlu, making Ismail the first Safavid Shah of Iran, with his capital in Tabriz. Ismail proclaimed Twelver Shi'ism to be the official and compulsory religion of Iran. Within 10 years he had conquered much of what was the Safavid Empire. He was, however, defeated by the Ottomans in 1514 and subsequently took to drink. He died in 1524. Due to pressure from the Ottomans, Ismail's successor, Tahmasp I, who rules until 1576, moves the capital from Tabriz to Kazvin. Under Shah Abbas the Great, who reigned between 1588 and 1629, the capital was moved again to Isfahan in 1598. Following the Mongol tradition, Turkish, Armenian, and Persian craftsmen were forcibly resettled in the city to ensure its prosperity. We have seen in the previous lecture that pottery in the Timurid and Turkmen eras, essentially the 15th century, continue into the Safavid 16th century. This includes Tabriz, making blue and white pottery with a stone-paste petra fabric severely dominated by felsic volcanics. Nishapur, perhaps the most important centre, making exceptional blue and white wares, with a stone paste petrofabric characterised by feldspars, and Mashhad, a minor centre with unusually clear quartz stone paste. But the reign of Shah Abbas and the establishment of the court at Isfahan led to an explosion of growth and prosperity for Iran in the 17th century, with new pottery production centres. Initial evidence for these production centres include historical information provided by European traders, who had by now come around the Cape of Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Iran became an important port of call for ships travelling from China with porcelain, some of which they sold in Iran and replaced them with cheaper Iranian copies, as their European customers could not really tell the difference. One of these was Raphael Damas, who said in 1660 that the best wares are made in Kerman. John Tavernier in 1654 said, "In Kerman they make earthenware which goes very near to porcelain and looks as neat and fine." A British East India Company letter of 1682 asked for pottery from Kerman and Mashhad, made in imitation of China ware. So Mashhad must have been quite important again. Then we have Jean Chardin, and he was there a couple of times in the 17th century, and he talks about the finest pottery being made at Mashhad, Shiraz, Yazd, Kerman, and especially Zaran, which is near Kerman, and also Isfahan, but he's not very complimentary. So, to these, I would like to bring your attention to Ray and Kashan, both with characterized stone paste production in the medieval period. Also Ardistan and Nain, mentioned by a chap called Ustad Ali Muhammad in 1885. Natanz is mentioned by Hans Wolff in the mid-20th century, and finally Maybud, which is described in a study of the pottery by Michelin Saint-Lèvre-Demont in 1971. Now, this is a table of all the stone paste data across the Middle East in one place. It's meant to be in order of how cloudy the quartz is with fluid inclusions, from very clear quartz at the top to mostly cloudy quartz at the bottom. It is a lot of numbers and can actually make me rather dizzy. Sometimes similar petrofabrics would never be confused because they are too far away in terms of time or place, like this 11th century Syrian lusterware centre versus this 15th century Iranian blue and white centre. Grain size can be problematic as the quartz is all processed, and in fact at least one treatise has said that the finer you grind the quartz, the better. Here are two centres where they have done just that. Some centres will use river cobbles and crush them for the quartz, but sometimes they use sand, and the rounded grains in the right-hand column record the grain size of the source sand. Sometimes they are very distinct. Here is the fabric attributed to Kashan in Iran. It is very distinctive from all other stone paste centres because it contains a lot of cryptocrystalline quartz, or chert. The left-hand side of this image is actually glaze, and the body is to the right, and you can see the abundance of chert. This is a precipitate sedimentary rock created from organisms with siliceous skeletons, and is usually found in limestone. However, one thing that occurs to me is how widespread chert, or flint, is in Europe, and a type of limestone called chalk. It's what the White Cliffs of Dover are made of. So if we take the map of Iran, and here's Kashan, and here's a map with a distribution of chalk over it, and you can see that if this was the geology of Iran, then centres like Isfahan, Shiraz, Yazd, Mashhad, and Nishapur would all have cherty petrofabrics. However, instead it has a geology of Iran, which is not left all nice and flat like Western Europe is, but has been all folded and squished. Disturbingly, the geology of the Kashan region has very little limestone. I have been to Kashan, but for a couple of hours when I was not well and on my way from Isfahan to Tehran, so I would not could not prospect the mountains at all. So, after analysing a great deal of 17th century pottery, I eventually defined a petrofabric I could assign to Kerman, another I could assign to Isfahan, and, disturbingly, 4 petrofabrics I thought were from Mashhad. This included the top one, which was the one based on the 15th century problem that had made in Mashhad on it, and also another one called Mashhad 1, which looked like it essentially. However, there was yet another that was similar again, but had felsic volcanics in it, and a slightly different one which also had felsic volcanics in it, but less. So I will start with the moderately satisfactory Kerman petrofabric, then cover the tolerable Isfahan petrofabric, and then talk about the Mashhad group of petrofabrics. Here is Kerman's geology, mostly surrounded by limestones. The frequent mentions of Kerman by European sources is reflected in the fact that all Safavid pottery I have analysed that was found outside of Iran, such as Bahrain and the Yemen, are of this petrofabric. My colleague Lisa Goldbeck even went to Kerman to hunt for pottery and collected it by digging into derelict 19th century mud walls. This included wasters at Site D. The source of quartz seems to be sand or sandstone, as the largest inclusions are rounded, like this fragment of volcanic glass. This feldspar shows alteration at the margin, which may also indicate it is from a sand source. This rounded grain of quartz has overgrowth, which happens when silica grows on the outside of a sand grain as it changes into a sandstone. But this large angular fragment of feldspar might argue against a sand source, unless a granitic stone grinding wheel was used to grind the quartz of the body. As I suspect that sometimes fragments of it will end up in the fabric of the pottery. Kerman made a lot of pottery that copied Chinese export wares as closely as possible. These were imperfect for trade with the Europeans who were trying to pass them off as Chinese back in Europe. Diagnostic of Kerman is this unique character-like mark called a tassel mark. One of the attributes of the Chinese pottery is that it will often have rain marks on the base, recording under which emperor's reign the vessel was made. This is one of the reasons that the Chinese originals have such a well-developed chronology. The tassel mark is presumably based ultimately on a Chinese character, but is only found on Kerman pottery. Here's another piece of pottery probably designed to confuse Europeans. This happy dragon is, however, nothing like the noble Chinese dragon. On the base you can see a better attempt at a Chinese rain mark and the scar where I took the sample. This one has a band of incised black paint, which you would not see on a Chinese original. This one has a band of calligraphy with a poem by Omar Khayyam. This one has a distinctive leaf in scroll motif only found on Kerman wares. Colourful slit-painted pottery is also found on Kerman pottery. This bottle, although mostly blue and white, has no Chinese influence in its decoration at all, so it can be seen that they were making pottery that was trying to pass for Chinese, other pottery obviously influenced by Chinese originals, and yet other pottery with a uniquely Iranian style. Isfahan would have been the capital from 1598 onwards, and became a great imperial city with abundant architectural expressions of Safavid culture, especially in mosques and palaces. This may be why the pottery centre for Isfahan seems to be some distance away, at the small town of Shah-Reza. I managed to go to Shah-Reza in 1996 and had a look at the pottery manufacturing that goes on there. Unfortunately, they were using imported clay, but this broken jar sitting in a corner of the workshop was said to be made at the pottery and was stone paste. If it looks like I'm about to throw up into it, I actually was. I had sunstroke at the time. I wasn't very well at all. I later got a sample of stone paste pottery which had been made in Shiraz because it said so on it, in Persian of course, and both of these samples define the petrofabric I will be calling Isfahan. This brings up another issue of where does pottery come from? Here is Isfahan, here is Shiraz, and here is the small oasis village of Maybud. This is the site of a pottery manufacturer, which was the subject of a doctoral thesis by Micheline Saint-Lève de Mont, submitted in 1971. She spent months there, which is how you should really study production centre, rather than just turning up for an hour or two like I have been doing. But the point of her study, I would like to mention, is that Maybud pottery was taken away and sold around Iran as pottery from Yazd. So a lot of people in Iran thought that the pottery from Yazd actually came from Maybud, or that they thought came from Yazd actually came from Maybud. So Yazd pottery comes from Maybud, and Isfahan pottery comes from Shiraz. This also reminds me of Jean Chardin's statement that the finest pottery is especially made in Zerand. Now, Chardin actually got around the country a bit, but any observer that did not go beyond Bandar Abbas might think that pottery from Zerand actually came from Kerman. Maybud is a bit closer to Yazd, however. This also brings up Shiraz. Chardin went to Shiraz, made a drawing of it. If he thinks they made pottery there, surely he was right, in which case, why have we not found any? So pottery of this Isfahan or Shiraz petrofabric includes quite nice blue and white, and not so nice blue and white. One of the distinctive attributes of this group is that fine lines are incised into the ceramic, creating the darker blue lines which outline the designs. Here is another. This is cobalt blue when fired under reducing kiln conditions. They also made a lot of turquoise and black, and polychrome slip painted pottery, including tiles and vessels. These are all that are left of large bowls. So if that wasn't confusing enough, let's look at Mashhad. Now, Mashhad and Nishapur, there's Mashhad and Nishapur, are actually not far from each other, just 74 kilometers away, although the degree of cloudedness and feldspars makes Nishapur quite distinct from the Mashhad petrofabrics. Here we have Nishapur, and here is Mashhad. And you can see they are in different sediment basins with a mountain in between. This is made of limestone, metamorphic rocks, and volcanic rocks. The importance of Mashhad takes us back to Twelver Shi'ism, for the 8th Imam, which is this one, was murdered and buried here, making it the Mashhad of Al-Rida. Later, or Arida, later it was just becomes known as Mashhad. Previously, there was just a village and a palace here, but because of the importance of pilgrimage to the shrine of Al-Rida, the settlement grew around it and increased in importance in the late 15th century under the Timurids, the period when the earlier pottery was made, which is inscribed with manufacture at Mashhad. I've highlighted in blue where some of the rivers are, which would have been the source of quartz in the form of cobbles, weathered out of the metamorphic rock to the south. The green blob at the centre is the extent of the city of Mashhad on a map from the 1940s. Although Mashhad would have started as a small village, how big it was in the Safavid period I have no idea, but the city is presently the second largest in Iran. Now, although the area was conquered by Shah Ismail at the beginning of the Safavid period, it was later captured by the Uzbek Khans from the steppes, and through the 16th century it changed hands several times, until finally conquered by Shah Abbas in 1598, after which time it remained part of Iran. Shah Abbas encouraged settlement of the town, and it may have been shortly after his conquest that pottery production began again, using the resources of the original centre, but also at another workshop perhaps further south and near the outcrop of volcanic rock, or at least downstream from it. So by 1630 they were making some very nice pottery in Mashhad, a lot of it copying or at least strongly influenced by Chinese ceramics, typically with a more convincing attempt at copying a imperial reign mark. The Mashhad II workshop also made very nice pottery and seems to have continued later on. One of the things they made in the Mashhad II workshop was lusterwares, which suggests that some of the potters that came to Mashhad after 1600 knew how to make lusterwares, typically with more explicitly Persian motifs. So here we have all three of these centers are making pottery that is trying to really look Chinese, pottery influenced by Chinese pottery, and also things which are just very Persian. So pottery continued to be made in Iran, but this is the latest or most recent pottery I've made a significant study of. So that basically covers all the petrography of pottery from the Islamic world I have done. Thank you.